presentations here. So what we're going to do is, well, again, my name is Mike Brethorst. I'm just introducing this again. I'm your city administrator here for Melrose. We have just completed a 2.5-hour presentation on rock arch, pool restoration, conceptual impacts, and so on. So what we're doing now is I put together questions along with the Melrose Lake Association, as well as I have a number of questions here from people in the audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat this just like when we go to a conference, and I will pose a question to the group. I would ask the group to a person to designate themselves to speak on this particular item. Please say your name and your organization that you represent, and then I'll just go right down the list. From there, we will limit this to 45 minutes. So at 8:45, I will have to cut this off because it's getting to be a long time. And again, I do thank you at the very beginning here. We will be posting this on our Facebook page as well as on YouTube, most likely on Friday once we get the IT people to help us break this into 3 separate presentations. And so I'll just begin here this evening, and we'll just go from there. So to begin, with respect to the potential channel realignment and sediment, the City of Melrose commissioned a dredging study for Melrose Lake. The study claimed that if a dredging of Melrose Lake would occur, it would last for 70 years. It has been claimed that in another situation that the sediment could last for only 10 years if we were to dredge the lake. As it relates to our situation for a channel restoration and channel realignment down to the hard pan, how would sediment flow be affected by a rock arch and those channel realignments?
You want me to do that?
And I'll just ask that you speak directly into the microphones so it picks it up clearly.
Yeah, I can speak to it just from a technical level. The rate of sedimentation can vary widely. There are actually dams built in China that filled up before they're finished construction. So it depends on the total sediment load of the river, both the bed load and the suspended load, and the size of the reservoir. So the rates can vary widely. And there are ways to further analyze that specifically by actually measuring the suspended load and bed load of the system and measuring the interception rate by the individual reservoir. But it can vary widely, and we have examples where it happened very quickly, and others where it was slower.
So Mr. Odlin, it's specifically as a follow-up for that, relating to a channel realignment here in our situation with the evens and flows throughout that, can we anticipate the sediment to theoretically flow through those new rock arches that will be created? Or do you see that potentially building back up in some form and having some type of maintenance?
No, that's correct. The difference is that I showed in my talk a slide on shear stress and stream power. Both are related to slope. So as we steepen the slope of the river, those variables increase. That's the ability to move sediment. So the design channel would be designed to be in equilibrium with those sediments, and that's what we've observed in similar projects.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, Melrose Lake bathymetric survey stated that the sediment depths vary between 5 feet to 12 feet. Depending on the location in the lake, how would the shorelines be affected by the channel realignment as this relates to that sediment that would be now turned into shoreline?
I guess maybe that's mine. The design of the partial rapids, I put this slide up for people that weren't here earlier. This is an example of a partial rapids. And what it does is bring the river up so that the sediment level becomes the floodplain. Floodplains are things that people do things on. I showed an example of someone who's mowing what used to be the reservoir bottom. Trees grow quickly in those sediments, and it would tend to revert towards similar to the river downstream of the reservoir. So those sediments consolidate. The image you see in there is during construction, and you can see the vegetation already rapidly growing on those reservoir sediments. But we haven't even completed that project, and we already have trees growing in that, in those reservoir sediments.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have here is, it's proposed to lower the elevation of the lake while keeping some sort of modified rock arches throughout this. Now this will do two things that we know, or that's been stated, is one is it will reduce the depth of the lake and narrow the water channel. This new channel will create additional exposed land along the same concern that we had before. Who will own this land and how will it be taxed? And another follow-up to that is, what type of valued impact would this have on the property owners? So maybe this is a question more for the city attorney. He did address this before, but Scott, if I could ask you to just comment on ownership again. And
at this point, our expectation is that the adjoining property owners will pick up the new land that's exposed. With the kind of caveat that that's assuming that when we go back and look at the arrangements that were made when they built the dam in the first place back in the 1860s, that the people that agreed to let the land be flooded didn't also forfeit, riparian rights to the Clarks. So we do have to go back and make sure that, yeah, you're the successor entitled to the original owner that signed the agreement to let the land be flooded in the 1860s. If they didn't surrender riparian rights, then yeah, you would still have that. You'd succeed to that. But until we go back and check and see what did those guys do back then when they set this up, you can't say definitely, absolutely, don't go refinancing your mortgage on the assumption you're going to pick up an extra acre, so now you can borrow more. It's too soon to do that. But at this point, we're expecting that the landowners will just pick up that land out and still own down the river.
that brings up a follow-up question actually for Mr. Johnson here from the County Assessor's Office. So the question is if there's theoretically, we'll give an example. My property is currently 150 feet deep. Under this new scenario, theoretically, you could be adding 200 additional feet to my property by the same width. How would my property values be potentially adjusted for resale or even county assessed? Do we have some type of concept on what that might or may not look like, especially if I'm gaining, say, an acre of land onto my parcel?
Yes. What we do as appraisers is that we study the market. Can everyone hear me? No? I'll stand up then.
Here.
To answer the question, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a problem with being on the end. As appraisers, what we do is we study the market to see what the contributory value is on land and buildings, and we isolate those and do some paired sales analysis. We develop what's called depth tables. Sometimes we also develop what we call frontage tables to assist us in recognizing the economies of size. And then, more importantly, we look at the quality of the land that's being obtained. If this does become part of the legal description of a property owner's holding, we would look at that and assign some value to it. How much that would be will remain to be seen, because as I said earlier, it's the interaction between buyers and sellers and the premiums that they place in certain components of the property that we have to identify and assign a value to. Will this change take place overnight? I don't think so. A lot of the things I've looked at over time is that if there's a change in market value, it's usually gradual. It's not like turning on a light switch and you have this additional value and it shows up the very next day. A good example would be an area where you had a gravel road, and the next year we have an all-purpose or all-season road. We know that there was some cost to make those improvements. We know that it's a much better road system than what was there before, but yet how much is the contributory value? And that usually shows up in sales over time, and we react to that accordingly. So I hope that answers the question, Mike.
Thank you. The next question that we have here is, there's concerns about soil conditions of what will most likely be after the sediment is there. So specifically relating to the 50-foot buffer rules, what type of soil conditions looking like, what type of plantings can I expect on my parcel of land?
Luther, you've probably seen actual, they probably don't even do plantings, natural vegetation will always take root.
Yeah, for the examples I showed, there's species that do particularly well, silver maples, those things that you naturally find in a floodplain. But trees, grass, most things that you'd want to grow would do well in those reservoir sediments. And so.
And obviously for conservation wise, and this goes with whether we're talking about any lake or any stream, you just don't want to see grass. You'd like to see native vegetation, flowers. I don't know, I'm just an administrator, but I don't know the ins and outs. Probably some of the DNR folks would know better. There's the ones that the roots grow down to 6 feet and build that a good stable, add stability to that shoreline. And so there's various ones that you could plant or let nature do its course, and some will just show up.
So a follow-up to that specifically is, there was some comments made to staff as well as to the council, as well as in written format, that there's going to be cattails, it's going to be very odorous smells. Have you seen that in other similar restoration projects? What have you seen those looking like?
Again, what we've seen is many of these reservoirs that are filled with sediment do tend to have an odorous smell. And when those are immediately exposed, they're going to smell for a little while. But what we've seen on these examples, like the one illustrated on the board shortly after the project is done, it starts growing trees and native vegetation. It's a very good point about it's important for buffers that we have deep-rooted vegetation. They're native grasses and wildflowers. I really kind of get into native grasses and wildflowers in my own place, and I plant them in wetland areas. And you can have beautiful frontage with diverse wildflowers and trees on that kind of a setting, and they're deep-rooted, so they really protect the riverbanks the way you want it.
Okay. Luther, I feel like we're asking most of the questions to you this evening, but so if the next question I have for you is, if the elevation of Melrose Lake is lowered, how will this affect the upstream flow, specifically like from Sauk River, from the lake, the reservoir to here? What type of impact could we expect in that area if you do a 6-foot elevation adjustment? Say
Yeah,
here?
so upstream of the reservoir, there's really no effect, because at that point, the natural riverbed is maintaining the grade of the channel. I think there's a misperception sometime that a dam somewhere downstream is controlling everything upstream, and that's not the case. The Sauk River has a lot of rock in it, and gravel and coarse materials, so they protect that grade and profile. So you wouldn't see any change. I noticed that comment up to Sauk Lake or something like that. That's a lot of river in between with a lot of rock bed that protects that grade naturally.
Maybe I could address that a little bit too. That is number 7 on the question list, and the issue with that question is that it's looking at the water elevations, not the bed elevations of the river. So your riffles are going to control that, or the flow line elevations are going to control that, not the water elevations.
Thank you for that. The next question I have actually comes from the Big Sauk Lake Association. Sediment carries additional phosphorus. Does removing a dam facilitate increasing the phosphorus downstream? And what about TMDLs? requirements. Do we have anybody that could speak to that?
Well, phosphorus tends to be bound in fine particles, like the particles that accumulate in reservoirs. In terms of nutrients, floodplains are very effective at treating nutrients. Now, you don't totally get rid of phosphorus in the atmosphere like you do nitrates. On the other hand, in river channels, those sediments are naturally deposited in the floodplain where they're tied up. It's a little different than in a reservoir where those sediments just keep on building and accumulating, and it's fine sediments that much of it is very dynamic, so it becomes available to those reservoir systems. And that's why a lot of reservoirs have water quality problems. One of the reasons.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have, this is probably directed our city engineer, and maybe Stearns as well as the Sauk River watershed, is Melrose currently have storm sewer pipes that empty into the Melrose Lake currently. Would storm water retention be required prior to discharge into a lake that would now be conceptually removed and turned into a river?
Well, Scott can maybe talk about the treatment. I think, one of the questions is where would the storm sewer dump? I mean, it could either be piped all the way down to the river's edge, or it could be dumped more into the floodplain. So you would have more of a natural rivulet type thing going through the floodplain. It kind of, they showed what the river looked like before the dam was put in here, and you've got all the fingers coming in. I mean, those storm sewers could be those fingers, or certainly through design we'd have to look at it, but it could be also piped down to the edge so that you would have a covered pipe through that floodplain area. Regarding treatment, I think the current requirements are probably that I'm guessing that the treatment would be optional, certainly something that would be desirable. Whether the requirements would be there to treat it now, I don't know that they would be any different than they are today.
No, there wouldn't be any different. I mean, we always want to see treatment. You want to try to get as much treatment, and whether that's a pond or draining it, like Mike said, into a natural wetland or waterway, or putting in a storm sewer separator that pulls out that sediment before it discharges to the lake or river. Those are all different options, and kind of as this project moves forward, if it's something that needs to be done, then that's where a district could, Sauk River Watershed District could step in and help with those types of projects.
Yeah, and I think, we could work with individual property owners. Some people may like a pond versus a grassed area. If you got a Labrador, you may want a pond. So those, certainly you could provide different opportunities on different pieces of property to do pondings in certain locations and not in others.
Yeah, and I know I've been talking too much, but I meant to show this in one of the examples where we handled storm sewers just in ponds, and it helped dissipate that energy of, you get a big event and there can be erosive energy coming at the outlets of those storm sewers. So that pond worked really well, just created a wetland that the turtles liked and other critters, and good way to handle that stormwater runoff, and then it can just flow through the floodplain into the river, in a channel or otherwise.
This is a question specifically relating to our current dam that we have now. We've received comments and questions specifically about what if the dam what if we do nothing and 5 years down the road the dam fails? Could we replace the dam one for one with our existing dam current design? Would that be a permitted use or permitted design from the DNR's perspective today?
I can certainly try. With regard to dam permits, I certainly would be working on any proposal that's brought forward, but Jason Boyle, who couldn't be here this evening, is our dam safety engineer, and he's the person who signs off on those types of permits. So any question about what dam would be allowed to be replaced would really best be forwarded to him as far as what he could foresee approving going forward. Could you guys hear that?
Okay, so the next, okay, so I'm just trying to make sure I get, that was a question from the audience that I had here, so. We'll just go on to the next question here, and I'll see if I can formulate the other question for a follow-up for that, if that's all right. The next question I have here is conceptual plans should, under the conceptual plan, with the multiple rock arches along the river channel, there have been comments made that the water upstream from these rocks would be good for fisheries as well as good for recreation. Could this be used for potential swimming areas? Is this true? And also, what would the depths of these pools potentially be? And what type of recreation could be realistically done?
They vary, don't they?
Yeah, so it'd be designed as a natural channel. The riffles that I showed, and there's one of them on the right-hand side of the photo. They're arch-shaped riffles. Typically, they scour out a deep pool, 8, 10, even 15 feet deep that we've observed below these things. So, and I had a video of kids swimming in a similar project to this, where the water was clear, and I specifically asked them, what do you think of this compared to the reservoir? And they said, this is a lot better. Well, the reservoir was filled with silt and muck, so it wasn't real suitable to fishing, to swimming. But yeah, I think it would provide both recreation and angling opportunities.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is, this is from the audience, and it specifically is, what will the impact on the water level in the river between Sauk Center and Melrose? And I believe we kind of answered this already, but specifically at the length between where the river crosses Highway 4 and where the river crosses Road 186. I know that's pretty specific and detailed, but
Don't know where that's
depths, basically the depths.
Upstream.
Yeah, upstream.
Yeah, there's
Several
no,
miles up.
yeah, there really would be no impact to any of the elevation change. Yeah, sorry. There really would be no impact to any change above the actual reservoir. You have a flat pool. Anything above that point is going to have very little impact at all, because the river has its natural riffles. In the diagram I showed, you have the riffles, which are the high points. That's what Greg alluded to earlier. And then you have the pools, which are the deeper points. Everything is at a slope. The minute that we put a reservoir in, it's at a flat slope. Anything above that flat slope, there's not going to be any impact upstream whatsoever to the flows or water levels, other than what would be naturally occurring from either drought or flood situations.
Thank you. The next question I have for you is, if the project is to move forward, or were to move forward theoretically, what type of costs would the abutting property owners owe or have to be partnering in this particular project as just currently discussed? And what type of maintenance would they be expected to perform?
I believe Amanda and Neil could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but when we had discussed this in the past, the thought of doing a river restoration and the discussion within that was that we could likely cover the costs of the restoration project from the funding that was received already. So instead of being a $5.1 million project, it could fit within the volume, or not the volume, but the grant funding that was awarded to the city already. So I think it's like 3.4 million or something like that, that we could fit that project within that. And any future funding needs for doing the restoration project, we could go back to Lessard-Sams and LCCMR and request further funding for accessory projects that are associated with that. So for example, if the stormwater ponds were desired, then we could put that as part of the project and build that into the project versus those costs having to come from the residents.
And I can speak for the Lessard Sam's portion of it because I worked on that application and I've corresponded on that. And we put into that application maintenance of that within that contract, which is a 5-year project from the grant date, which, if approved, would be July 1st of 2019. So depending on the time frame of when this goes, you'd still have several years of maintenance that could be allowed within that and paid for within that grant.
This question will be directed towards myself. Is how much money does the city have allocated for the Melrose Dam for maintenance? Right now, the city of Melrose has $10,000 annually that we're allocating to the fund. So that right now we have about $20,000 in that fund. So the next question we have is specifically relating to excuse me, 1 second, just misplaced my notes. Examples of dams that were removed at a height of 15 feet and dams that were replaced. Why has it been determined that a rock arch is the most appropriate or the recommended approach for a dam removal such as Melrose?
Well, I guess the alternative, I've taught this around the country. Different states do things differently. Many states do what we call rip and run. Just rip the dam out and let the river shape itself. And that works well in where the reservoir sediments are mostly gravel in coarse materials. It's a cheap way of doing things. But in these more cohesive silts, it tends to incise. So we found this approach works really well in reconnecting the floodplain. We don't want the river to down cut so that the banks are high and vertical and inaccessible and erodible. We want something where we have a connected floodplain so it's accessible for people and also stable in terms of vegetation that we need to hold those banks.
Well, most of my questions have been answered this evening. So there's really not many more questions that I have specifically written here. Maybe if we have any additional questions from, I'm going to have to limit it to our elected officials in the room here. I just want to be careful about how we move forward. Are there any other questions that we want to get answered today? Otherwise, what I can do is I would be happy to gather any additional questions that weren't answered here and present them to the selection committee here today. So unless there's any other specific questions that we do have, I'll just ask. Sure, go ahead.
Sorry for writing so many questions, actually only a couple of them. One of the speakers early on talked about the heavy metals in the sediment, and my question would be, if they become the landowners, do they bear responsibility for the heavy metal sediments?
I think to summarize that specific question is if there's any potential hazards that are found in those new soils after the land is transferred back, who's responsible for maintaining that if it's been exposed?
Well, I think I might have had the example on the arsenic contaminated sediments. Is that what you're speaking to? Or was it
Actually, I
something
think
else?
it was the gentleman.
Oh, yeah. If I'm recalling what he said was that they're below threshold levels. I'm not familiar with the particular values here, but where those are stabilized in place by design, there hasn't been an issue in the projects that I've been involved in, and maybe someone else has some perspective to add to that.
Well, maybe I can, and I haven't reviewed the report, but from what I recall is that the levels were so low that you could dredge the material and dump it on the farm field without any adverse effect. Once you get to a certain concentration of arsenic or heavy metals or whatever, if you dredge it out and you're above that threshold, then you need to take it to a landfill. So These were low enough that they don't present any health hazards. Certainly, could there be a pocket of something? Sure, there could. And typically, in that situation, the property owner is generally not held responsible for that.
Actually, I do have a few more questions here from Melrose Lake Improvement Association is, during construction, how long of a period can we anticipate for the lands to dry out, you know, once it recedes back? And also, how would that potentially be mitigated during the initial construction phase, you know, for impact on the properties? How many years have you seen when you've built this, does it take for that shoreline to stabilize itself? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 years?
Well, I guess the best example of that, again, is the image on the screen. That is just as actually during construction, the image that you see there. And at that point, they were already dewatering to the point where it wasn't mucky to walk on. There's vegetation growing on it. It is a floodplain, so if you get a big flood, it'll get wet and then it'll dry just as floodplains do. So you could compare it to other reaches on the river where the river floods in the spring and then it comes down by May, it's dried out to where you're walking on it.
Okay.
Wouldn't be any different.
Just maybe to add to that a little bit, I know there's comments made about the odor and everything. I've been working on some similar projects related to drawdowns, and we have our wildlife folks, our shallow lakes folks have done many of these over time. Usually within a span of 2 weeks, we have plant material that can be as high as 3 feet tall, okay? 2 weeks, provided that that sediment gets exposure to sun and air, you start growing plants. So it doesn't take long for plant material that's already has resident seed bed, and there's plenty in there from upstream. Well, I guarantee that. So I guess I would try to allay that fear a little bit. I mean, yeah, there's probably a span in there, a few days, several days until it dries out. Depends on weather, like Luther was saying, whether or not we have a flood event during that time or whatever. But if it dries out, it's a short amount of time, and also we're going to be growing plants. So.
Actually, that brings up another question that I've had from some residents is, what would my potential shoreline look like? Would it be a straight drop? Would it be a gradual slope? How could this be theoretically designed to support the transition from your current elevation shoreline to where the theoretical shoreline could be? What would that potentially look like?
The riverbanks, again, we're trying to match that bankful dimension, which doesn't have these big high banks. So it gets there during the flood, comes up a couple feet to the floodplain. But on pools, you'll tend to have a bit of a drop to the water at base flow. If you see the meanders on the inside of the band, is where we naturally get what we call point bars. And those are gradual slopes, and here it'll form as sand and gravel that'll, over time, that would slope down to the water. And that's where it's easy to walk down because it's just a gradual slope clear to the water. On the outside side of the pools, it tends to be a little steeper drop, but not a high drop, a drop of the bank full to the bank full height down to the water.
The other thing to remember is that we are, you know, if this goes forward, the partners would encourage, like Scott had even mentioned, native vegetation or natural vegetation along the channel. Now, that does not mean that you cannot access that, or at least have some access similar to what you have now, or something mowed or something cut, or, you know, something stable that would get to that. It's just that we wouldn't want that to be mowed from the city limits to where the dam site is now, or downstream from, you know, stream bank to stream bank, you know. So there's still access that can be maintained. We want people to respect and use the river, and that's part of the whole program.
This is actually, now I'm getting on a roll, I'm getting more questions for you. So specific, to change gears a little bit relating to funding. Now, we've talked about Lessard Sams and LCCMR. And could somebody speak here in regards to where does that funding come from? And what is the likelihood of that funding being there, say, in 10 years?
Maybe I'll tackle that since I have been assisting with some of the funding applications. So like I mentioned when we started talking about funding with the funding options, the Lessard Sams money was derived from the 2008 Clean Water or Legacy Amendment that everybody had a chance to vote on. And that gets derived out of there. That council gets appropriated a certain amount of that dollars and can put it towards what they call habitat projects. So there was a little bit of misconception on what that money could be used for, like dredging and that sort of thing. The legislative language does not allow that money to be used for language. It's got to be directly involved for habitat type projects. As far as the money for that sort of type of activity in, let's say, 5 or 10 years down the road, there's no guarantees that by making an application at that time that it would be approved. That money is in its 10th year, obviously, right now, so it'll be around. It was a 25-year appropriation, so it'll be around for another 15 years. But if we turn that money down as partners right now from, Lessard Sams and LCCMR, that doesn't really look very good on coming back and asking for it again. I'll just put it that way. I mean, that's probably a fair assessment if you say, well, we don't want it now, but we want it maybe later. I don't know that that looks very good.
My name is Amanda Hillman, and I am the restoration coordinator for the River Ecology Unit. And I work directly with the Lessard Sams Council and sit on the hearings and things like that. And it is a very competitive process. There's a lot of good projects around the state, and I don't know that there are any guarantees. And I also feel like it's a growing business, not a business, but a growing endeavor for a lot of places in the state. So there, moving forward, there could be more competition to contend with as well. So just something to think about.
We partnered with SWCD, DNR, oh shoot, I can't even remember who we all went. Minnesota Land Trust to do some, and I think we're going to get some money this year. There's a lot of phased projects in Lessard Sams. So you get a good project, you show that you're actually doing good work, they're more apt to then give you more money to continue on that work. And so I think the fact that this project was given some money is a big plus, because there were a couple other dams removals and dam projects that really got beat up by the council. Greg was there. I don't think he didn't get beat up, but
No, we didn't.
but there was some really touchy projects that created a lot of questions and a lot of issues for that council. And so I think moving forward, though, bringing this reservoir to maybe a river system in that Lessard Sams Council is a very good project because of the multiple benefits. Water quality is a secondary benefit when you start talking about that council and money, but that habitat, bringing back the fish habitat and the connective corridor along that river is a huge deal for that council, and it's a very positive aspect of this project, in my opinion, for that council.
A follow-up question is, could this particular conceptual project be phased, meaning that the city of Melrose moves forward with its channel realignment onto the east side of the bridge project this year with some conceptual understandings and concepts on what it could look like in 4 to 5 years and still be effective design? Is that a potential?
As far as the permitting process goes, it absolutely can be a phased project. The only concern that I have is how that would work with regard to the bridge replacement. And the reason that I say that is that if you go with a partial pool rock arch rapids, the design of the bridge changes and can be more cost-effective design. If they're trying to do their replacement now with the conditions that are there now, they have to stay with a more costly design for the bridge. And the FEMA conditional letter of map revision, all of that still stays the same. You may have to do 2 of them with regard to phasing if it's that far out. I'm not entirely certain how FEMA looks at projects like that, but phasing is something that I had recommended initially that you look at if you're concerned about funding. So I would say from my standpoint and the permitting side, it's very possible to phase.
One thing to keep in mind with phasing is that the Lessard funds do have a 5-year window for restoration. So if you're trying to stay within the allotted funds for now, that's something to keep in mind.
Mike, if I might ask a question. Hypothetically, to say if we were to split the phasing at the dam, design the bridge, everything downstream such that it could be accommodate a partial pool, rapids upstream, what time frame I don't know, but could the funding be used for the downstream portion of that?
Greg?
So I was going to answer that anyway, so I'm glad you asked that. But I think the only way to make that possible is if you know that the dam's going to come out within that window of that funding of 5 years. If it's not going to come out within that time frame, then you're not gaining the habitat value that they're looking for. And like Scott said, there were projects that were highly scrutinized that council looked at with dam removals all over the state. And whether or not you think you're fortunate to have that money staring you in the face or not, we were not one of them because we were looking at restoring that habitat connection in the river channel.
Well, that really concludes the prepared questions that we have this evening. We do have a few questions that have been presented by the audience, but I believe most of those were answered during the reports period. What I will do, though, is if there are questions from residents afterwards, please, Patty Hazy, our city clerk over there, or myself, will document them and we'll make sure that we get you those answered. So pending that, we are 5 minutes ahead of schedule for that. And I do want to thank everyone for being here this evening. The council takes this incredibly seriously, and they're researching this as we speak. So I'll conclude this by thanking everybody for attendance, thanking the experts for coming here this evening, and the audience and our state representatives for being here as well. So thank you very much.